Before we start the presentation, I was listening to the presentation before, and I was kind of amazed because I don't have much to say anymore. I mean, one of the presentation was data is static, or the conclusion, and I fully agree with that. I mean, before GaiaX, I was also a developer and an architect, and I've never heard about the name data connector. The industry is doing billions of revenue per year with elastic load transform load, data pipeline, back and forth. I've never heard about the term and the name or the need for a data connector. But the day I arrived in GaiaX, everyone was talking about data connector, like you cannot do any data transfer without data connector. It took me 3 years to understand what they exactly mean by that. So data connector as a concept, yes, I buy it. Data connector as a piece of software, there are alternatives. I'm not saying that this is not needed, but there are alternatives. And basically it was in one of those, that slide is maybe one of the first slide I draw in GaiaX at the very beginning. So data is static. That's my USB stick, floppy disk, whatever with data on it. If I want to process it, to store it, to transfer it, I need to have a service. And if you want to have control over your data, you need to have a control over your services. The valuable data is usually created and structured, so it's coupled with the service. And if you are not able to compute policy to make sure that the service going to process the data next is under your control, or you trust that, then you have no data, so-called sovereignty. And that's the only time I will use this buzzword, promise. Finally, for that slide, in fact, that took me way longer than expected. We talk sometimes about building blocks also. There are a few blueprints that are existing out there about building blocks. And that's interesting to see because in those building blocks we talk about identity, policies, monitoring, auditing, which are applicable to services, and you never talk about services. So the next time you see a map with building blocks, you might be raising the question, where are your services in your data pipeline? So back to that one. Now I can start the presentation. Back to that one, we have a mobile on the on that left side. The mobile is going to send data. The data is going to be aggregated online with another database that you can join. You can train the model. Then the model can be later used for inferring and so on. That's a very basic data pipeline. You just collect things and you process them. What we have right now is that everything is locked in. So we have in European, and when I draw those boxes is because most of the European market, SMEs, that's based on, most of the European economy is based on SMEs, 90% of it. So it's not like that we are very fragmented. We have to be honest about that. And if we are not able to break those silos, then we will stay fragmented. We will stay fragmented, and we know who will be the winner of that. We have market share reports from several consulting firms. In 2017, the European hyperscalers were representing 23% of the market share. 5 years later, that's 13. So in 5 years, we divided by 2 the market share of European cloud service provider. And at the same time, the market of the cloud market was multiplied by 5. So there is business to make. And we need to make sure that we break those silos. How we are going to do that? Well, again, we had the nice presentation about expense. If you want to be able to port the application which is there on the left back to the next step on the right, you need to be able to describe that, okay, I want my service to be run that way, I want that billing, I want this monitoring, and so on. In today's presentation, I will talk about something slightly different because I don't want expenses already doing the work, so there is no need to redo that part. And I would like to talk about the notion of interoperability and conformity assessment. So you might have seen that slides before, or you might have read something similar, part of the European interoperability framework, where we have 4 layers of interoperability. Legal, is it even legal to transfer data outside of Europe, for example? That's out of scope for today. You have organizational, that's where we talked a bit about the beginning of the ecosystem. Semantic, what does it mean to be a data processor, a data intermediary? I mean, if you want to have nice evenings with friends, ask them what is a data intermediary services. Everyone has their own version right now. And then technical. About the technical one, the one that were in Barcelona, you might remember that one. And I was asking what is the difference between the certificate on the left and the certificate on the right. The answer is that the one on the left, so I updated my slides with an animation now. The one on the left is that this is an IDAS certificate. So with that, I can sign legal document, or the document I sign will have a legal enforcement, a legal value. The one on the right, that's just something that I generated locally on my PC. So again, that's about the first layer, technical interoperability, the one at the bottom, semantics. So even if this is the same API using X509 certificate, they mean something different. They have a different value. And that's how we can build what I have trust. So instead of inventing something new from trust, I just open a dictionary and I read the definition. Trust is something that first you cannot give. That's on you to make the evaluation based on the likelihood of someone to perform an action. So I know we are abusing a bit of the word trust, like trust services, trust wallet, and so on, but that's just a storage or secure wallet or a safe one, and then you trust this wallet to do what they claim to be doing. This decision, when you have A and B making the assessment, you can, of course, nest them or make it recursive so that the targeted party decision will later make the decision about someone else. And that's how you build this chain. You need to be able to this chain, and the talk just before me was saying that they have I-18 certification ongoing. So how do we leverage, for example, those 18 certifications that I'm quite sure will cost some money and time and effort in the policy decision that enable those services to be composed together? There is a bit of definition to agree on. And for the definition, again, I tend to say I'm lazy, but that's just reading specification. The ISO one about conformity assessment. A funny animation. So when you are a holder and you issue something yourself, that's called a declaration. You declare something. That was the term that was used in the very early days of GaiaX, a self-declaration. But that's in the Casco definition. Everything which is underlined, it's a term that comes from the Casco definition, the ISO specs. So when you sign something and you issue something yourself, that's a declaration. When you ask someone to grant you or to issue something for you, which is impartial here is the keyword, that's called a certification. I missed something. If you declare something, you self-sign. If you want that to be legally relevant, not legally binding, but legally relevant, you need to have so-called TSP, Trust Service Provider. So with which identity are you signing those claims? It doesn't necessarily to be always EIDAS. There are other levels of signature that you can use that will be legally relevant. The difference between legally relevant and legally binding is that EIDAS, that's legally binding. Legally relevant, that's a proof that you can bring to the court. You have some well-known cases in front of the court where emails were sent to agree on a contract. And then with the forensic, it was proven that the header of the email using DKIM parameter, DKIM, was coming from a truly signed on web server and not just a spam. So the email wasn't a legal proof, but it was legally relevant for the judge to make a decision. So that's the big difference. We can have legally relevant claim. For the certification, for example, you have in France Secnum Cloud, in Germany C5, in Italy AGIP, I remember, or AGIP. About cybersecurity, we'll have the next one with EUCS, very funny one after data intermediary services in an event. ISO 27001 and so forth. For health, for finance, there is tons of certification. Not everyone is accredited, allowed to issue those certifications. So you need to define who are the authority that can grant the accreditation for issuing those certificates. And that's what we will call trust anchors. So basically you are within the ecosystem, health, finance, and so on. And you will need to define what are the so-called trust anchor, and you have different type of trust anchor. We talk about the service provider first, then we have the authorized source of information or the conformity assessment body. Another term which is being used to summarize that is that both declaration and certification are called attestation. And that's why in GaiaX documentation we replace everything by attestation. Finally, to know who is entitled to make such decision, to appoint such trust anchor, to have this very generic name, we have so-called data space. Ecosystem authority, that are the party eligible to appoint those parties to issue such attestation or attestation, declaration or credential. I could stop here. I will try to summarize that a bit. So that's when we agree on that terms, which is basically just a summary of the ISO specification on Casco. And I need to click, I don't know how many times. At some point that should work. Yes. That's the difference between a technical interoperability and semantic interoperability. So what I just talked about, that was a semantic one. Organization, when we have roles that appoint such parties. Technically speaking, to exchange those credentials, so when I talk about credential, I'm talking here about verifiable credential. In the context of GaiaX, W3C verifiable credential. Well, you can use existing standards. SIOP, self-sovereign, self-issued OpenAI Connect profile. OpenAI Connect for VC issuance. They have ongoing work, that's the draft 13, the latest one. OpenAI Connect for VP, verifiable presentation. So how do you present something and not how do you issue something? That's the counterpart of the previous one. That's the draft 20. Then you have presentation exchange by the DIF, the Decentralized Identifier Foundation, Identity Foundations. You have, all the JOSE specification, GWT, GWS, GWK, GWE, and so on, the RFC. And that's good enough. I mean, you just glue them together, you have your technical interoperability, but that alone will never make the upper part working together. And that's the only way, I believe, that we can leverage the hundreds of thousands of euros that this gentleman has invested here in his company as part of the policy that, for example, using expense, then you can really combine services together. And that's making now a huge loop together, I hope, puzzle fitting together. As a summary of the what I said before, the key, I will say, takeaway of the Eclipse Trust Protocol, the proposal that is made by the GaiaX Association to the Eclipse Data Space Protocol, working group, sorry, that's summarized in that table. That's establishing a link. I mean, W3C credential, they already exist. ISO specification, they already exist, but no one has ever made a bridge between the two. So now we can have the table and see, okay, the object of the assessment, the object of conformity assessment, is the equivalent of the credential subject in my VC. The CAB is the equivalent of the issuer. Sometimes that's not everything is equivalent. An attestation, that's not exactly the same thing that the proof, because attestation, well, I don't have a paper, I don't have the picture here on that slide, but usually you have those nice PDF hanging in the wall of some companies because that takes time and that's something that you might want to display. But that's not something that you can call as a proof. I mean, a bit of Photoshop and you can create your own. So how do you make that really relevant as part of your negotiation? While using VC and the proof, you can do that. So that's not that visible because on the slide initially that was red and green, but you see the small cross, which is we don't take that part. We leverage the VC and the cryptographic proof. However, there is no commonly accepted vocabulary, the semantic one, for VCs. So that we lean on the ISO one. And that's what I meant by the PDF hanging on the wall. So basically that enables us to move from the left part to the right part. Another one that I don't necessarily need to go here because I spent so much time already on the previous slides, that's the formalism, the workflow that are part of the certification, the conformity assessment with the specs to come up with those certification schema. If we have an ecosystem, if we can use data space or federation, and they have their own compliance rules, how two ecosystems becomes interoperable? Do they share the same workflow? Do they understand the same? Do they have the same understanding when they come up with their schema? Well, one proposal is to lean on the existing very mature industry standards of conformity assessment body, which is here summarized in that workflow. Here, well, you don't see much on the slides, but basically that's the proposal for the Eclipse Trust Protocol to the Eclipse Foundation, that we focus on the interoperability layer of organization and semantic. In theory, we haven't checked internally with the developers. We could use other type of credential than W3C, like add-on creds or MDoc, which is another spec from the European Commission, also as an ISO standard. However, they might not all support the same type of keys, vocabularies, nor linked data that we require to express this model. So maybe we need to either update the other credential type or limit ourselves to W3C VCs. Here you don't see any requirement or specific need, hard-coded need to a precise technology. You have the schema, well, we use JSON-LD, but you could use other type of schema. The shape, that's the way you control the rules of your ecosystem, but again, there are different technology for doing that. The type of trust anchor, there is one famous specification from the ETSI, that's the one used by the European Commission to list all the credential, all the trust service provider for eIDAS. That's an option. We could use something else, it's just that they are nicely fitting together, so that will be a recommendation. But if someone would like to implement that differently, why not? And finally, I will just go through quickly that slide because that's way too complex and I don't want to bother you with that. Yeah, sorry. And I would like to stop on that one. At the end, the objective is that we lower the barrier that we had before. So everyone with their own way of implementing services, their own specification, certification, no necessarily a mean to express the policy, to transfer, to move the service or to move the data. Hopefully using this model of we agree on terms, certification, declaration, and so on, we can both leverage what the market has already been using for years, embed that into policies, and make those services then interoperable with the data flowing on it. Because data don't flow on Rainbow, data flow on REST services. Thank you.